The story of surveillance does not begin with a blinking cursor on a screen, nor with the cold hum of data centers in the 21st century. It stretches back through centuries of human organization, where the desire to see, to know, and to control has always been intertwined with the promise of order, safety, and at times, the very definition of what it means to be a citizen. In this segment, we will walk together through that genealogy, from the Roman census to the medieval watchtower, from Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon to Michel Foucault's analysis of discipline, and onward to Deleuze's societies of control. We will pause at the moments when a single watchful eye, whether a stone tower or a telegraph line, reshaped power relations, and we will hear the voices of those who first articulated the paradoxes that still haunt us today. Imagine a bustling Roman market, the air thick with the scent of spices and the clamor of merchants haggling over olives and amphorae. Beneath that lively surface, the state conducted a census, a systematic counting of every male citizen, property holder, and slave. The purpose was ostensibly practical, to assess taxes, to allocate military service, to know the size of the empire's labor pool. Yet, as the Roman scholar Cicero once wrote, the state must be aware of its people, otherwise it cannot govern. The census was an early form of data collection, a way of rendering the invisible, population, wealth, movement, visible to the governing authority. It set a precedent. Knowledge of the many becomes a lever for the few. Fast forward a millennium, and we find ourselves in the narrow, cobbled streets of a medieval town. The night is dark, the walls are high, and the threat of fire, theft, or marauding bandits looms large. To mitigate that danger, townsfolk erected watchtowers at strategic points, on the highest ramparts, at the gates, even on the roofs of prominent guild halls. These towers were manned by volunteers or paid watchmen, who scanned the horizon with lanterns, shouting alarms at the first sign of trouble. The watchtower was more than a physical structure, it was a symbol of communal vigilance. The very presence of an ever-watchful eye altered behavior. Merchants secured their wares earlier, travelers hurried through the streets, and the notion of privacy receded, replaced by the acceptance that someone somewhere might be looking. One concrete example of this medieval vigilance is the watchtower that stood over the city of Lübeck in the late 14th century. Records from the Lübeck City Council note that the tower, known as the Wachtmhafen, was staffed by a rotating crew of guild members. Their nightly rounds were recorded in a ledger, noting the number of fires averted and the thefts prevented. The ledger reads in a terse medieval German, Nachtwacht hat des Führer im Haus der Weber entdeckt und des Führer gelöscht, bever is des Gans Viertel erreicht. The very act of writing down the watchman's deeds turned a moment of observation into a permanent record, a precursor to the log files that now line our servers. But vigilance can also become scandal. In 1767, the city of Birmingham, England, became the stage for a notorious episode now known as the Birmingham Watch Scandal. The town had established a group of men tasked with patrolling the streets and reporting any suspicious activity. The watch was funded by a modest municipal levy, and its members were expected to be impartial guardians of public order. Yet, as the local pamphleteer Thomas Hinton reported in his fiery broadsheet, the watchmen, instead of protecting the honest tradesmen, have been bribed by the local merchants, turning a blind eye to their smuggling while harassing the poorer weavers. The scandal erupted when a group of weavers, fed up with false accusations and extortion, publicly displayed the watch's ledgers, revealing a pattern of selective enforcement. The episode sparked a public debate in the town's assembly, with some arguing that the watch was essential for safety, while others saw it as a tool of oppression wielded by the elite. The Birmingham watch scandal illustrates an early awareness that surveillance, even when cloaked in the language of protection, can be co-opted to reinforce existing hierarchies. The 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham, observing the practicalities of prison design, proposed a radical architectural solution, the Panopticon. Bentham's own words, penned in a letter to his friend James Mill, capture the essence of his vision. I conceive a circular building with a central observation tower from which a single guard may see every cell without the inmates ever knowing whether they are being watched. In Bentham's mind, this design would produce a perfect form of discipline, one that relied not on brute force, but on the internalization of surveillance. The prisoner, aware of the possibility of observation, would regulate his own behavior. Bentham argued that such a system would be more humane, more efficient, and ultimately more just because it would reduce the need for corporal punishment. He wrote, "The Panopticon will be a new instrument for the improvement of mankind, a great step towards a rational society." Bentham's Panopticon was never built as a prison, but its conceptual power spread far beyond architecture. It entered the philosophical discourse as a metaphor for modern power structures. In 1975, Michel Foucault seized upon Bentham's design in the opening pages of Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. Foucault's famous description of the Panopticon reads, "The Panopticon is a machine for dissociating the individual from the group, for making him an object of knowledge, a means of controlling the conduct of individuals." He argued that the Panopticon was not merely a building, but a model for a new mode of power, disciplinary power, where surveillance becomes internalized, where the individual self polices out of the mere possibility of being seen. Foucault traced the spread of this logic through schools, factories, hospitals, and eventually the modern bureaucratic state. To understand how this disciplinary logic manifested in the 19th century, we turn to the British Empire's telegraph network. The telegraph, a marvel of its age, allowed messages to travel across continents in the blink of an eye. Yet, the empire quickly recognized its potential for surveillance. In 1857, the British Admiralty issued a secret directive, later uncovered in the National Archives, ordering that all telegraph traffic between London and the colonies be intercepted, copied, and analyzed by a newly formed cipher department. The directive states all communications passing through the imperial lines shall be examined for subversive content, with particular attention to any correspondence that may indicate seditious activity. By the 1870s, a cadre of telegraph operators, known colloquially as the Eyes of the Empire, were tasked with monitoring the flow of information, flagging any mention of political dissent, trade union organization, or colonial resistance. The telegraph thus became an early digital artery, not only for commerce but for the empire's gaze upon its subjects. The British telegraph surveillance was not merely a technical feat, it reshaped power relations across the empire. In India, for example, the colonial administration used intercepted telegrams to preemptively arrest leaders of the Indian National Congress, stifling the early nationalist movement. In Ireland, the same network was employed to monitor the activities of the Fenian Brotherhood, leading to a series of arrests that weakened the organization's capacity to coordinate uprisings. The telegraph's reach turned distance into proximity, allowing the central authority to extend its watchful presence into far-flung territories. It was a precursor to the modern data-driven surveillance state, where the collection of metadata can be as powerful as the content itself. A second historical anecdote from the far reaches of the Russian Empire underscores how surveillance can be weaponized against political dissent. In 1890, the Moscow police, under the direction of the secret police force known as the Okhrana, launched an intensive surveillance campaign targeting revolutionary circles. The police infiltrated socialist reading rooms, placed informants within workers' unions, and most dramatically, installed a hidden listening device, an early form of wiretap, in the basement of the revolutionary newspaper Iskra. The device captured conversations between key figures such as Georgy Plekhanov and Vera Zasulik. When the police finally presented the transcripts to the Tsarist court, the evidence was undeniable. The crackdown that followed led to the exile of several leading revolutionaries, and the event sent a chilling message throughout the movement, that even private meetings could be penetrated by the state's eyes and ears. The Moscow surveillance operation demonstrated that the logic of the Panopticon could be extended beyond physical spaces into the realm of sound, and, eventually, into the digital ether. These historical moments, watchtowers, censuses, telegraph monitoring, secret wiretaps, share a common thread. They each introduced a new technology or institutional arrangement that expanded the capacity of those in power to see, to record, and to act upon the behavior of the many. Yet they also sparked resistance, debate, and philosophical reflection. The thinkers we have mentioned, Bentham, Foucault, Deleuze, each offered a lens through which to interpret these developments, and each engaged with earlier ideas such as Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan and the social contract tradition. Hobbes, writing in 1651, imagined a sovereign who, in order to escape the war of all against all, must possess the power to enforce order. He famously declared, "Covenants without the sword are but words." Hobbes's Leviathan is a metaphor for a strong, centralized authority that can guarantee safety, but only if the subjects consent to surrender a portion of their liberty. The social contract in Hobbes's formulation is a rational agreement. Individuals trade some freedom for the protection that a sovereign can provide. When we view surveillance through this Hobbesian lens, we might argue that the watchtower, the census, the telegraph, these are tools that enable the sovereign to keep its promise of safety. The counterargument, therefore, is that surveillance is a neutral instrument, a means to protect, not to oppress. The first counterargument we encounter in contemporary debates mirrors this Hobbesian justification. Surveillance is a tool for safety, not oppression. Proponents point to the reduction of crime rates in cities that have installed extensive CCTV networks or to the thwarting of terrorist plots through mass data analysis. They argue that the benefits, fewer murders, fewer bombings, outweigh the intrusion into private life. In this view, the Panopticon becomes a benevolent guardian, a rational design that deters wrongdoing through the mere possibility of being seen. A second counterargument seeks to rehabilitate Bentham's original intention. Bentham himself was a utilitarian, concerned with maximizing happiness for the greatest number. He claimed that the Panopticon would reduce the need for physical punishment, thereby sparing individuals from pain. Supporters of this reading argue that the Panopticon is not inherently dystopian. It is a rational, efficient design that, if implemented with proper safeguards, can promote order without cruelty. They point to modern smart city initiatives that use sensors to manage traffic flow, reduce energy consumption, and improve public health as examples of surveillance serving the common good. Both counterarguments, however, encounter formidable challenges when we examine the historical record. The Birmingham watch scandal shows how a system intended for safety can be subverted by those in power to enforce class distinctions. The Moscow police's wiretap operation demonstrates how surveillance can be wielded to silence dissent, regardless of any claimed protective function. Moreover, the very architecture of the Panopticon, as Foucault emphasized, produces a self-disciplining subject, a person who internalizes the gaze and modifies behavior even when no one is actually watching. This internalization can erode autonomy, creating a society where freedom is not merely curtailed by external force, but by an ever-present sense of being observed. Gilles Deleuze, writing in the late 1990s, extended Foucault's analysis to what he called societies of control. Deleuze argued that the Panopticon, while still relevant, was being superseded by a more fluid, continuous form of surveillance. He wrote, "The society of disciplinary institutions, whose functioning is based on the division of space, is being replaced by a society of control, whose functioning is based on the division of time." In Deleuze's view, modern technologies, credit cards, GPS, internet platforms, allow for real-time tracking of individuals across multiple contexts, not confined to a single physical space. The control is no longer a tower overlooking a courtyard, but an invisible network that follows us from the workplace to the home, from the street to the digital marketplace. Consider, for a moment, the analogy of a river. In the age of the Panopticon, the river is dammed, its flow restricted to a single channel, observed from a fixed point. In Deleuze's societies of control, the river is no longer dammed. It is diverted, split into countless tributaries that flow through a landscape of sensors, each tributary feeding into a larger reservoir of data. The river's water is still there, but its pathways have multiplied, and the ability to monitor its movement has become pervasive and instantaneous. The shift from a static tower to a dynamic network mirrors the historical transition from watchtowers to telegraph lines, from censuses to digital databases. When we trace the genealogy of surveillance, we also encounter the medieval guild watch, an institution that predates the modern police. Guilds, such as the Weavers of Florence or the Merchants of Bruges, organized their own watchmen to protect trade secrets and enforce standards. In a letter dated 1324, the guild master of the Florentine silk weavers wrote to the city council, "Our watch shall guard the looms, lest any rogue steal our patterns, for the prosperity of our craft depends upon secrecy." Here, surveillance serves an economic function, protecting the collective knowledge of a community. Yet this protective gaze also creates a boundary between insiders and outsiders, a delineation of who may be trusted and who may be excluded. The Guild Watch thus foreshadows the modern corporate surveillance that monitors employee productivity, protects intellectual property, and at times surveils consumers through targeted advertising. The Roman census, too, was not a neutral act of bookkeeping. It was a means of asserting the state's claim over its subjects, a way of making the population legible. The scholar James C. Scott, in his influential work Seeing Like a State, describes how the state's drive to make society legible involves simplifying complex social realities into maps, numbers, and categories. The Roman census reduced a diverse population into taxable units, military obligations, and civic status. By doing so, it enabled the state to extract resources, levy taxes, and conscript soldiers with greater efficiency. The act of counting, therefore, was an act of power, an early form of what we now call datification. Each historical moment we have examined reshaped power relations in a specific way. The Watchtower introduced the notion that a visible, elevated presence could deter wrongdoing, but also that the presence itself could become a source of fear. The census transformed the invisible mass of people into a quantified resource, making the state's reach more precise. Bentham's Panopticon offered a theoretical model where the possibility of observation could replace overt coercion, yet it also revealed how the internalization of that possibility could erode personal freedom. Foucault's analysis illuminated how disciplinary mechanisms spread across institutions, creating a culture of self-regulation. Deleuze's societies of control showed how the digital age dissolves spatial boundaries, turning time itself into a medium of surveillance. In the modern digital age, these historical threads converge. The internet, smartphones, and cloud computing have created a panoptic field that is both global and intimate. Algorithms analyze our movements, our purchases, our conversations, producing predictive profiles that anticipate our desires, and perhaps more unsettlingly, our dissent. The same logic that justified a medieval watchtower's lantern now justifies a facial recognition system that can identify a protester in a crowd of thousands. The same logic that Bentham used to argue for a rational prison design now underpins smart policing initiatives that claim to allocate resources efficiently based on data analytics. Yet the modern era also offers new possibilities for resistance. The very tools of surveillance can be repurposed for accountability. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and civil society organizations use the same data streams to expose abuses of power. The Edward Snowden revelations in 2013, for instance, demonstrated how mass metadata collection by the National Security Agency could be uncovered and debated publicly. In a sense, the digital age has introduced a new form of the watchtower, one that is decentralized, crowdsourced, and capable of turning the gaze back onto the watchers. To deepen our understanding, let us return to the primary sources. Bentham's own description of the Panopticon, written in 1787, declares, "The design of this prison will be such that the prisoner, knowing that he may be watched at any moment, will be forced to conduct himself as if he were constantly observed." Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, adds, "Visibility is a trap." He emphasizes that the trap is not the physical presence of a guard, but the mental state induced by the possibility of being seen. Deleuze, in Postscript on the Societies of Control, writes, "Control is the new discipline. It is the diffusion of the apparatus of power." Each of these statements underscores a shift from overt coercion to subtle, pervasive influence. When we juxtapose these ideas with Hobbes's Leviathan, we see a tension. Hobbes writes, "The right of nature is to use whatever power one can have to preserve one's own life." The Leviathan, then, is justified as the ultimate protector against the chaos of nature. Surveillance, under Hobbes's logic, is the question that haunts us today is not merely whether we are being watched, but what it means to be seen, to have our most intimate data laid bare before a network of eyes that never blink. In the quiet moments between the hum of a city's traffic cameras and the soft ping of a health tracking app, we are invited to ask, what does it cost us to live under such constant visibility? And perhaps more urgently, who decides the terms of that visibility? To explore these questions, we must first settle on some basic concepts, the building blocks of any ethical discussion about surveillance. Privacy, as defined by the American scholar Alan Weston in his classic 1967 work, is the claim of individuals, groups, or institutions to determine for themselves when, how, and to what extent information about them is communicated to others. Weston's definition is strikingly precise, for it captures both the right to keep information concealed and the right to control its flow. It is not merely a matter of secrecy, it is about agency, about the power to shape one's own narrative. When we speak of autonomy, we invoke a deeper philosophical lineage that stretches back to Immanuel Kant. Kant's notion of autonomy is the capacity of rational agents to legislate moral law for themselves, to act according to principles that they could will as universal. In other words, autonomy is self-legislation, the freedom to choose one's ends without external coercion. Finally, informed consent is the procedural expression of both privacy and autonomy. It is the requirement that individuals receive clear, comprehensible information about what will be done with their data and that they voluntarily agree to it. Consent, in its ideal form, is the moment when the individual's autonomy meets the state's or corporation's request for information. These three concepts, privacy, autonomy, consent, are not isolated. They intertwine like threads in a tapestry, each reinforcing the others. When consent is truly informed, it protects privacy. When privacy is respected, it safeguards autonomy. But in the world of modern surveillance, these threads are constantly being tugged, frayed, and sometimes deliberately cut. Let us consider two vivid contemporary illustrations that bring these abstractions into stark relief. First, imagine a bustling public square in a major metropolis, tourists snapping photos, street vendors hawking their wares, commuters hurrying to catch the next train. Overhead, a lattice of facial recognition cameras watches the flow of people, each lens equipped with algorithms that can match a passerby's face to a database of millions. The promise, as its proponents argue, is safety. Identifying suspects in real time, preventing violent incidents before they erupt. Yet for the individual strolling through that square, the experience is altered. The knowledge that every expression, every glance is being catalogued transforms the public space into a kind of digital panopticon, a term the philosopher Michel Foucault borrowed from Jeremy Bentham's 18th century prison design. In Bentham's original Panopticon, a single guard could observe all inmates without being seen. The mere possibility of observation ensured compliance. In our modern square, the guard is an algorithm, the inmates are all of us, and the architecture of power is invisible, embedded in code and cloud. Second, consider the health data tracking apps that proliferated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments and health agencies urged citizens to download applications that could monitor symptoms, trace contacts, and alert users to potential exposure. The data collected GPS coordinates, Bluetooth proximity logs, even biometric information were presented as a collective shield against a deadly virus. Yet the same data, once aggregated, could be repurposed for insurance underwriting, employment screening, or targeted advertising. The promise of public health is powerful, but it sits uneasily beside the individual's right to keep one's bodily information private. In both examples, the tension between collective benefit and personal autonomy is palpable, and it is here that philosophical analysis becomes indispensable. To understand how we might navigate this tension, we turn to the thinkers who have mapped the moral terrain of visibility. John Rawls, in his theory of justice, offers a tool that is both elegant and profoundly relevant. The veil of ignorance. Rawls asks us to imagine that we are behind a veil that hides all particular facts about ourselves, our race, gender, wealth, abilities, and crucially, our data footprint. From behind that veil, we would choose the principles that govern society. If we did not know whether we would be a data-rich executive or a data-poor citizen, would we consent to a regime where facial recognition cameras are everywhere and health data is harvested without robust safeguards? Rawls would argue that rational agents, seeking to protect themselves against the worst possible position, would demand strong protections for privacy and meaningful consent mechanisms. In his words, justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. The veil of ignorance thus becomes a moral microscope, focusing our attention on fairness in the distribution of informational power. Judith Jarvis Thompson, a contemporary legal scholar, reframes privacy not as a static right but as a dynamic practice she calls contextual integrity. She writes, "Privacy is not a thing but a process. It is about the appropriate flow of information." According to Jarvis Thompson, the moral assessment of a surveillance practice depends on whether it respects the norms of the specific context, who is sharing information, with whom, and for what purpose. A facial recognition camera in a high-security airport may be justified under one set of norms, while the same technology in a public park violates the expectation that one can move anonymously. Similarly, health tracking apps are acceptable when the data stays within the public health sphere, but becomes suspect when that data is sold to commercial entities. Jarvis Thompson's framework reminds us that privacy violations are not merely about the amount of data collected, but about the disruption of expected informational flows. Luciano Floridi, a leading figure in information ethics, expands the conversation to the very nature of information itself. He proposes that we live in an infosphere, a global environment of data, information, and knowledge that envelops us. In this view, the moral status of individuals is intertwined with the health of the infosphere. Floridi writes, "The ethical dimension of information is not an add-on to the existing moral framework. It is a fundamental reorientation of our moral imagination." He argues that privacy is a right to informational self-determination, a claim to shape one's own informational identity. For Floridi, the ethical challenge of surveillance is to preserve the integrity of the infosphere while allowing it to flourish, a balance that demands new norms of transparency, accountability, and proportionality. These three perspectives, Rawls's justice as fairness, Jarvis Thompson's contextual integrity, and Floridi's informational ethics, intersect and reinforce each other. They each ask us to consider not just the immediate utility of surveillance, but the broader implications for the social contract, for the expectations that underpin everyday interactions, and for the very fabric of an information-rich world. History offers us stark anecdotes that illustrate how quickly the balance can tip. In 2013, Edward Snowden disclosed that the United States National Security Agency had been collecting bulk telephone metadata from millions of citizens, a program known as PRISM. The revelation sent shockwaves through the globe, exposing a hidden architecture of surveillance that operated far beyond the narrow confines of targeted investigations. As Snowden himself reflected, we cannot have a free society if we are not free to speak and act without fear of being watched. The Snowden disclosures forced a reckoning. Legal scholars invoked the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, while technologists began to develop encryption tools to shield communications. The episode underscores how unchecked data collection can erode the very autonomy it claims to protect, turning the promise of security into a pretext for pervasive monitoring. A second, more recent anecdote unfolded in 2018, when the Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed that the political consulting firm had harvested the personal data of up to 87 million Facebook users without explicit consent. This data was then used to create psychographic profiles that targeted political advertising with uncanny precision. The scandal ignited a global debate about the commodification of personal information and the adequacy of consent mechanisms hidden within lengthy terms of service. As former Facebook whistleblower Christopher Wiley noted, the idea that we could be manipulated without our knowledge is terrifying. Cambridge Analytica's actions demonstrated how the market-driven view of consent, where users are presumed to have freely agreed by clicking "I agree," can be a thin veneer over exploitative practices. These anecdotes are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger pattern where the promise of technological advancement collides with the erosion of privacy norms. To understand the full scope, we must also look back to earlier philosophical concerns about the gaze. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, "The look of the other is the look which makes me aware of my existence as an object." When we become visible to an external observer, we risk being reduced to an object stripped of the fluidity that defines our subjectivity. Surveillance, in this light, is not merely a technical operation but an ontological shift. It transforms us from autonomous agents into data points, from beings who act to beings who are acted upon. Cross-references to bioethical debates further illuminate the stakes. In the realm of genetics, for instance, the prospect of a genetic surveillance state has been raised by scholars who warn that DNA databases could be used to track individuals across time and space, linking health conditions to criminal investigations or insurance premiums. The same principles that govern the use of facial recognition data apply to genetic information. Consent must be informed, privacy must be protected, and the collective benefits must be weighed against the potential for discrimination and loss of autonomy. The bioethical principle of respect for persons, which undergirds the Belmont Report, resonates with Kantian autonomy. Individuals must be treated as ends in themselves, not merely as means to an end. Returning to our two vivid examples, we can now interrogate them through these philosophical lenses. Consider the facial recognition cameras again. A Rawlsian analysis would ask, would we, behind the veil of ignorance, accept a society where every passerby is instantly identifiable? Likely not, unless the technology were tightly regulated, subject to strict oversight, and limited to contexts where the risk of harm is demonstrably high. Jarvis Thompson would examine whether the deployment respects the contextual norms of public spaces. Does the presence of cameras align with the expectation that one can move anonymously through a park? If not, the practice violates contextual integrity. Floridi would caution that the infosphere must retain a balance. While data can enhance security, it must not overwhelm the ecosystem, leading to information overload, loss of trust, and eventual disengagement. The health tracking apps present a different set of considerations. During a pandemic, the collective stakes are high. The potential to save lives can be compelling. Yet, a utilitarian argument, often invoked in public health, holds that the loss of privacy is justified by the greater good. This claim, however, rests on a calculation that assumes the benefits outweigh the harms, and that the harms are reversible. Critics argue that once data is collected, it rarely disappears. It can be repurposed, sold, or weaponized. Moreover, the utilitarian calculus can be swayed by political agendas, leading to mission creep, where emergency measures become permanent fixtures. A Rawlsian perspective would demand that the benefits be distributed fairly and that the most vulnerable are not disproportionately burdened by surveillance. Jarvis Thompson would ask whether the data flow respects the health context. Are the data shared only with legitimate health authorities, or do they leak into commercial realms? Floridi would remind us that the health data contributes to the infosphere's richness, but only if it is managed responsibly, preserving both accuracy and privacy. counterarguments arise, and they deserve careful attention. The first is the utilitarian claim that privacy loss is justified by collective security. Proponents point to statistics suggesting that surveillance can deter crime, locate missing persons, and accelerate emergency response. They argue that in a world of finite resources, the marginal loss of privacy is a small price to pay for the massive gains in safety. Yet this view can obscure the distributional effects of surveillance. Those who are already marginalized, racial minorities, low-income communities, political dissidents, often bear the brunt of intrusive monitoring, while the benefits accrue to the broader public. Moreover, the assumption that surveillance automatically leads to security is contested. Empirical studies have shown mixed results. Some surveillance programs fail to produce measurable reductions in crime, while increasing public distrust. From a Kantian standpoint, treating individuals as mere means to a security end violates the categorical imperative, which requires that we act in ways that could be willed as universal law. If we accept that privacy can be sacrificed for security, we open the door to ever greater intrusions, eroding the very autonomy that underwrites a free society. The second counterargument is the market-driven view that consent is freely given through terms of service. Companies often argue that users voluntarily download apps, agree to policies, and therefore the data collection is legitimate. Yet the reality of digital consent is far more complex. Terms of service are notoriously lengthy, written in legalese, and presented in a manner that discourages thorough reading. Cognitive overload and the urgency to access a service create a situation where consent is more a formality than a genuine expression of autonomy. Critics invoke the concept of procedural unfairness, noting that consent obtained under such conditions fails to meet the standards of informed, voluntary agreement. In the words of philosopher Charles Taylor, the self is formed in dialogic relation with others. When that dialogue is unbalanced, the self cannot truly consent. Thus, the market narrative of free consent often masks a power asymmetry that undermines authentic autonomy. These counterarguments do not render the pursuit of surveillance entirely untenable. Rather, they sharpen the need for nuanced positions. One such position is the idea of privacy as a public good. Just as clean air and public safety are shared resources that benefit everyone, privacy can be seen as a collective asset that sustains democratic participation, creativity, and trust. When privacy is protected, individuals feel safe to express dissent, explore new ideas, and engage in civic life without fear of reprisal. Treating privacy as a public good shifts the conversation from an individualistic "my data, my choice" to a communal responsibility. Societies must safeguard the informational environment for the benefit of all. This perspective aligns with Rawls's principle of justice as fairness, emphasizing that the rules governing data must be chosen behind the veil of ignorance, ensuring that no group is systematically disadvantaged. Another emerging concept is collective consent. Rather than relying on isolated agreements between a user and a corporation, collective consent envisions a democratic process where communities negotiate the terms of data collection and usage. This could take the form of local data councils, public deliberations, or participatory budgeting for surveillance technologies. In such a model, consent is not a one-time click, but an ongoing, deliberative practice that reflects the evolving values of the community. This approach resonates with Jarvis Thompson's contextual integrity, as it grounds consent in the lived realities and expectations of specific groups, and with Floridy's emphasis on the health of the infosphere, as collective deliberation can foster transparency and accountability. To bring these ideas into sharper focus, let us consider two concrete analogies. Imagine a library where every book is open to the public, but each reader must first sign a ledger stating which sections they intend to peruse. The ledger protects the library's integrity, ensuring that readers respect the boundaries of private collections while still allowing access to shared knowledge. In a surveillance context, the ledger represents a transparent consent mechanism that records what data is collected, for what purpose, and who may access it. Just as the library safeguards rare manuscripts, a robust consent ledger safeguards sensitive personal data, balancing openness with protection. A second analogy draws on the concept of a city's water system. Water is a vital resource that must be distributed equitably, monitored for quality, and protected from contamination. The city employs a network of sensors to detect leaks, measure usage, and ensure safety, yet these sensors are installed with public oversight, clear regulations, and avenues for citizen input. If a private company were to install its own hidden sensors without disclosure, the trust in the water supply would erode, and the risk of misuse would rise. surveillance technologies function similarly. They can serve the public interest, detecting threats, improving health outcomes, provided they are subject to democratic oversight, transparent standards, and mechanisms for redress. When the infrastructure is privatized and opaque, the public good is compromised. Historical anecdotes further illustrate how societies have grappled with the balance between visibility and liberty. In ancient Athens, the practice of ostracism allowed citizens to vote to exile a public figure for 10 years, a form of social visibility that could be wielded for political protection or abuse. The ostracism process was public, transparent, and bound by a collective decision, highlighting that even in a democracy, the power to render someone visible or invisible required communal consent. Conversely, during the Soviet era, the state's pervasive surveillance apparatus, epitomized by the KGB's monitoring of mail and telephone communications, created a climate of fear that stifled dissent and eroded personal autonomy. The contrast between these two historical moments underscores that visibility can be a tool for democratic participation or a weapon of authoritarian control, depending on the institutional framework that governs it. Returning to the present, we can see how the ethical frameworks we have discussed intersect with real-world dilemmas. The deployment of facial recognition cameras in public squares, the story of surveillance begins not with the blinking cameras on a city street, but with a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries. How does the act of seeing shape what we are allowed to be? In the quiet moments before a lecture, we might ask ourselves what it means to be watched, to be known, to have our movements turned into data points that can be read, sorted, and acted upon. The answer, as Michel Foucault reminds us, lies in the intricate knot of power and knowledge, a knot that tightens each time a new technology learns to watch us more closely. Foucault first articulated the knowledge-power nexus in his seminal work, Discipline and Punish. He wrote, "Power is not an institution and not a structure, neither is it a certain strength we are endowed with. It is the name that we give to a complex strategical situation in a particular society." He went on to argue that modern societies have become societies of surveillance because the very mechanisms that produce knowledge about us also produce the power to shape us. The Panopticon, that imagined prison designed by Jeremy Bentham, becomes for Foucault a metaphor for the way disciplinary power operates. A single watchtower, unseen by the inmates, compels self-discipline. Yet the Panopticon is only the beginning. In the 1990s, Gilles Deleuze sensed that the architecture of control was shifting. He wrote, "Societies of control do not confine themselves to a space, but rather to a movement, a flow." Deleuze's societies of control are no longer built around static walls, but around the continuous capture of data as we move through digital networks, as we swipe, click, and travel. When we look at the concrete manifestations of these ideas, two modern examples stand out. The first is predictive policing, epitomized by the COMPAS algorithm. COMPAS, which stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions, promises to assess the risk that an individual will reoffend, using a blend of criminal history, demographic information, and behavioral indicators. Law enforcement agencies feed the algorithm with past arrest records, and the system returns a score that can determine bail, parole, or even the allocation of police resources. The promise is alluring. A data-driven objectivity that can cut through human bias, that can allocate police presence where it is most needed, that can prevent crime before it happens. Yet the very epistemic claim that data can reveal a true risk is contested. Critics point out that the data fed into COMPAS is itself the product of historic policing practices that disproportionately target minority neighborhoods. The algorithm, then, does not neutralize bias. It reproduces it hidden behind a veneer of mathematical precision. The second example is corporate data mining for targeted advertising. Companies like Google and Facebook have built business models on the extraction of behavioral data, what we search, what we like, what we linger on. Shoshana Zuboff, in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, describes this process as the unilateral extraction of private experiences for profit. The data is aggregated, turned into predictive models, and sold to advertisers who can then tailor messages to the most receptive individuals. The power here is not simply the ability to predict consumer behavior, but the ability to shape desire itself. When a streaming service suggests a new series based on a pattern it has detected, it is not merely offering a recommendation. It is nudging the viewer toward a particular cultural consumption, reinforcing certain narratives while marginalizing others. To understand how these contemporary practices echo earlier moments of surveillance, we can turn to two historical anecdotes. In the 1960s, the FBI's COINTELPRO program set out to monitor, infiltrate, and disrupt civil rights organizations, anti-war movements, and Black Power groups. Agents collected phone records, mailed anonymous letters, and even fabricated evidence to sow distrust among activists. The program's goal was not merely to gather intelligence, but to fracture the collective power of dissent. As historian Ward Churchill later noted, COINTELPRO was an attempt to turn the tools of a democratic state into weapons of repression. The program's legacy illustrates how surveillance can be weaponized to maintain existing hierarchies, a theme that resonates with Hannah Arendt's analysis of the banality of evil. Arendt argued that ordinary bureaucrats following procedural rules can become complicit in atrocities. In the context of COINTELPRO, the agents were not fanatics. They were functionaries applying a bureaucratic logic that rendered the oppression invisible, just as the Panopticon renders the observer invisible. A more recent anecdote comes from the United Kingdom's expansion of road traffic cameras in the early 2000s. The government rolled out thousands of speed cameras and red light cameras, promising a reduction in accidents and a more efficient enforcement of traffic laws. Yet the public backlash was swift and vocal. Protesters argued that the cameras turned public roads into surveilled highways, where citizens were constantly monitored, fined, and recorded. The debate highlighted a tension between the claimed public safety benefits and the perceived erosion of civil liberties. The UK case shows how the architecture of control can be justified through the language of safety, while the underlying power shift remains contested. These stories, past and present, converge around a set of thinkers who have tried to articulate the deeper implications of surveillance. Hannah Arendt in The Human Condition warns us that the most terrible thing about the banality of evil is that it is not an evil that is exceptional, but an evil that is ordinary, that is carried out by ordinary people. In ordinary circumstances, when surveillance becomes an ordinary part of daily life, a camera at a traffic light, an algorithm that decides who is more likely to reoffend, the banality of evil takes on a new digital form. The ordinary becomes the instrument of power, and the ordinary citizen becomes both subject and object of knowledge. Pierre Bourdieu's concept of symbolic power adds another layer. Bourdieu argued that power is not only exercised through force or law, but also through the ability to define what counts as legitimate knowledge. In a surveillance society, the data-driven metrics, risk scores, click-through rates, engagement ratios become the new currency of legitimacy. When a police department declares that a neighborhood is high risk because an algorithm says so, it is not merely describing a statistical fact. It is imposing a symbolic order that justifies increased policing, that reshapes the very reality of that neighborhood. Bourdieu would say that this is a form of symbolic violence, the imposition of a classification that the subjects themselves may not recognize as arbitrary. Shoshana Zuboff pushes the analysis further, coining the term surveillance capitalism to describe how corporations have turned personal data into a raw material for profit. She writes, surveillance capitalism unilaterally claims human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data. This claim reframes the individual not as a sovereign actor, but as a source of value to be harvested. The power of surveillance capitalism lies not just in the ability to predict, but in the ability to influence, to nudge, to steer, to shape the future choices of individuals before they are even conscious of those choices. The architecture of control, then, is no longer a wall that keeps people out, but a lattice that guides them through a pre-designed path. To see how these ideas intersect, we can map the digital panopticon onto the modern landscape. The classic panopticon is a physical structure, a tower in the center of a circular prison from which a single guard can observe every cell without being seen. In the digital age, the tower has been replaced by data centers, cloud servers, and algorithmic dashboards. The cells are our smartphones, our social media profiles, our credit cards. The guard is not a single individual, but a network of corporations and state agencies that can query our data at any moment. As scholars such as David Lyon have noted, the digital panopticon is a diffuse, networked system of surveillance that is both more pervasive and more subtle than the original architectural metaphor. The power is no longer exercised through direct observation, but through the capacity to aggregate, correlate, and predict. One of the most pressing concerns with this architecture is algorithmic bias. When an algorithm learns from historical data, it can inherit the prejudices embedded in that data. The COMPAS case illustrates this vividly. An investigation by ProPublica in 2016 found that the algorithm was more likely to label black defendants as high risk, while underestimating risk for white defendants. The bias was not the result of an explicit racist rule, but of the statistical patterns present in the training data. This raises a crucial philosophical question. If the algorithm is a neutral tool, but the data it learns from is biased, where does responsibility lie? Is it the designers of the algorithm, the institutions that collect the data, or the broader social structures that produce the data in the first place? Here we encounter the first counterargument. Some scholars argue that algorithmic transparency can neutralize power imbalances. They claim that if we open the black box, allow public scrutiny, and demand explainability, we can mitigate bias and restore accountability. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, enshrines a right to explanation, suggesting that individuals should be able to understand how decisions affecting them are made. Proponents of transparency point to open source models, independent audits, and community oversight as pathways to a more equitable system. They ask, if we shine a light on the algorithm, does the darkness of power recede? Yet this optimism meets a second counterargument, rooted in the work of scholars like Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. Surveillance merely reflects pre-existing social hierarchies rather than creating new ones. From this perspective, the data-driven systems do not generate novel forms of domination. They simply make visible the inequalities that already exist. When a predictive policing algorithm flags a neighborhood as high risk, it is not inventing a new problem. It is mapping a pattern that has been shaped by historical overpolicing, economic disinvestment, and systemic racism. The argument goes that if we address those root causes, poverty, education, housing, the algorithmic output will change accordingly. In other words, the technology is a mirror, not a hammer. Both counterarguments have merit, but they also reveal a tension at the heart of the philosophy of surveillance. Transparency, while valuable, can be co-opted as a performative gesture, offering the illusion of accountability without dismantling the underlying power structures. Conversely, focusing solely on the mirroring function of surveillance risks downplaying the active role that data practices play in reconfiguring social relations. The epistemic claims of data, that numbers are objective, that patterns are neutral, must be interrogated. Data is always a selection, a framing, a translation of lived experience into symbols. As Donna Haraway reminds us, we are all part of the same data-making process, but not all data are created equal. To unpack these case studies further, let us return to predictive policing. The algorithmic pipeline begins with data collection, police reports, arrest records, calls for service. Each entry is a narrative, a moment of interaction between officer and citizen, already laden with power dynamics. When these narratives are digitized, they become points in a statistical model. The model then produces risk scores, which inform decisions about where to allocate patrols. The feedback loop is critical. Increased patrols lead to more arrests in the targeted area, which feeds back into the data, reinforcing the perception of high risk. This self-fulfilling cycle exemplifies what Bourdieu would call the reproduction of social space. The algorithm does not simply predict crime. It helps produce the conditions that make the prediction come true. Critics have proposed alternatives, such as community-based oversight boards or the use of fairness-aware, machine learning techniques that adjust for disparate impact. Yet these solutions often presuppose that the underlying data can be cleaned of bias, an assumption that overlooks the structural origins of the data. Moreover, the very act of labeling an algorithm as fair can shift the focus away from the broader question of whether the surveillance apparatus itself should exist in its current form. Are we seeking to perfect an instrument that, by design, concentrates power in the hands of a few? Turning to corporate data mining, the stakes are different but no less profound. When a user clicks on an advertisement for a new smartphone, the platform records not only the click but the time of day, the device used, the previous browsing history, the inferred socioeconomic status. These data points are fed into a model that predicts the likelihood of purchase, which then informs the price offered, the timing of follow-up ads, and even the design of the product itself. In this loop, the consumer becomes both the source of data and the target of manipulation. Zuboff argues that this creates a new form of power that is both unprecedented and invisible. The power lies in the ability to anticipate and shape demand before the consumer is consciously aware of their own desire. An analogy can help illuminate this process. Imagine a gardener who watches a plant grow, notes its needs, and then begins to prune, water, and fertilize in such a way that the plant's shape conforms to the gardener's vision. The gardener's knowledge of the plant's growth patterns enables control over its future form. In the digital realm, the data scientist is the gardener, the user's behavior is the plant, and the algorithm is the pruning shears. The garden may appear natural, but its contours are the result of deliberate interventions. If the gardener decides to favor certain species over others, the biodiversity of the garden changes. Similarly, if the algorithm prioritizes certain consumer profiles, the cultural landscape shifts. The philosophical implications of this are far-reaching. If we accept that knowledge is power, then the accumulation of knowledge through surveillance is a concentration of power. Yet power is not monolithic, it is relational. Michel Foucault emphasized that power is exercised through networks, not just top-down hierarchies. In a surveillance society, the networks are digital, the nodes are data points, and the flows are algorithms. The architecture of control is thus a fluid, adaptive system that can reconfigure itself in response to resistance, regulation, or market forces. Deleuze's notion of societies of control captures this fluidity. Control is no longer about imprisoning bodies within walls, but about modulating flows of information, shaping the conditions under which choices are made. Consider the public backlash against the UK's road traffic cameras. Citizens protested not only the fines, but the feeling that their movements were being recorded and judged without consent. The backlash prompted a debate about the balance between safety and privacy, leading to legislative hearings and, in some cases, the removal of certain cameras. This episode illustrates that the architecture of control is not immutable. It can be contested, negotiated, and reshaped. Yet the underlying logic remains. Data collection is justified by a higher-order goal: safety, efficiency, profit, which then legitimizes the intrusion. The interplay between surveillance and symbolic power becomes evident when we examine how risk scores are communicated to the public. A neighborhood labeled as high crime on a city's interactive map carries a stigma that can depress property values, deter investment, and reinforce social exclusion. The label itself becomes a form of symbolic violence, a narrative that shapes perception regardless of its statistical accuracy. Bourdieu would argue that this is an exercise of symbolic power, the ability to define reality for others. The data, then, is not neutral. It is a tool for constructing social hierarchies. In confronting these dynamics, we must ask, what alternatives exist? Some scholars propose a data commons, where individuals retain ownership of their data and collectively decide how it is used. Others advocate for algorithmic accountability frameworks that require impact assessments, bias audits, and public reporting. Yet these proposals often rely on existing legal and economic structures, which themselves are products of the surveillance architecture. A deeper transformation might involve rethinking the very premise that personal data is a commodity. If we reconceptualize privacy not as a shield against intrusion, but as a collective right to shape the conditions of knowledge production, we shift the balance of power. Returning to the philosophical lineage, we see that Arendt's warning about the banality of evil resonates with contemporary concerns about techno-bureaucracy. The routine operation of algorithms, the daily updating of dashboards, the incremental rollout of new data collection tools, these are ordinary practices that, when aggregated, produce profound effects on autonomy, equality, and democracy. The banality lies not in malicious intent, but in the uncritical acceptance of efficiency and accuracy as virtues in themselves. When a city council adopts a predictive policing tool because it promises data-driven safety, it may be overlooking the subtle ways in which that tool reconfigures the relationship between citizens and the state. Deleuze's shift from disciplinary societies to societies of control also invites us to consider how resistance must adapt. In a disciplinary society, resistance might take the form of escaping the prison or sabotaging the watchtower. In a society of control, resistance may involve disrupting data flows, creating alternative networks, or developing privacy-preserving technologies. The rise of end-to-end encryption, decentralized platforms, and zero-knowledge proofs can be seen as tactical responses to the pervasive reach of surveillance. Yet these tools also raise new questions. Who imagine a world where every step you take, every word you whisper into a microphone, every flicker of light from your screen is recorded, cataloged, and analyzed? The notion feels almost mythic, yet it is the lived reality for billions of people in the 21st century. In this moment, we pause to ask, how do individuals and movements carve out spaces of freedom within a landscape that seems designed to erase it? How does resistance emerge when the very infrastructure of daily life is woven with sensors, algorithms, and data pipelines? To answer these questions, we will trace the lineage of counter-surveillance, follow the footsteps of thinkers who have mapped the terrain of everyday tactics, and examine concrete acts of defiance that illuminate the politics of reappropriation. Our story begins not with a single invention, but with a tradition that stretches back to the very idea of privacy as a social good. Michel Foucault, in his seminal work The Practice of Everyday Life, reminds us that the everyday is an arena of tactics, a field of strategic improvisations that the weak can employ against the strong. Foucault's insight is a compass for our exploration. Resistance is not always a grand, overt rebellion. Often it is the quiet, inventive maneuver that slips through the cracks of power. The modern digital age simply expands the arena, turning streets into data streams and whispers into packets of code. One of the most palpable tactics of today's resistance is encryption. When you open the Signal app, you are not merely sending a message. You are participating in a practice that transforms a private conversation into a shielded enclave, invisible to prying eyes. The underlying technology, the double ratchet algorithm, continually refreshes keys, ensuring that even if a third party were to capture a single message, the rest of the conversation remains unintelligible. Tor, the onion routing network, operates on a similar principle of layered concealment. Each relay peels away a layer of encryption, revealing just enough to forward the data without ever exposing its origin or destination. These tools embody what Lawrence Lessig calls code as law, a phrase he coined to illustrate how the architecture of software can enforce or liberate behavior. In the case of encryption, the code constructs a legal-like boundary that the state must respect. Unless it can break the code, the law cannot reach. Edward Snowden, whose 2013 revelations sparked a global debate about mass surveillance, offers a vivid illustration of the ethical calculus behind such resistance. In his memoir, Permanent Record, he writes, "I realized that the only way to change the system was to expose its inner workings, to make the invisible visible." Snowden's act was not merely a leak. It was a strategic exposure designed to force a public reckoning. The ethical tension he navigated, between the duty to protect national security and the imperative to safeguard civil liberties, mirrors the broader dilemma of any counter-surveillance act. Does the act of resistance itself risk becoming a tool for the very powers it opposes? Consider the 2014 live streaming of police encounters during the early days of the Black Lives Matter movement. Activists equipped with smartphones turned the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, into a real-time courtroom. As a police officer approached a protester, a bystander held up a phone, the camera rolling, the image beamed to the world. The footage ignited a cascade of public outcry, legislative hearings, and a re-examination of policing practices. Here, technology served as a democratizing force, allowing ordinary citizens to capture and broadcast evidence that would otherwise have been hidden. Yet the same technology that empowered the protest also gave law enforcement a new tool for surveillance, as authorities began to monitor live streams for preemptive intelligence. The episode illustrates a paradox. The very mechanisms that enable resistance can be co-opted, turning a shield into a sensor. In the artistic realm, the Number Stop the Surveillance street art project offers another lens through which to view reappropriation. Murals appear overnight on the walls of major cities, Berlin, New York, Sao Paulo, depicting eyes rendered as broken mirrors, or CCTV cameras turned into blooming flowers. One particularly striking piece in Berlin shows a camera perched atop a tree, its lens replaced by a bird's eye, the bird in flight. The artist's statement reads, "When we reimagine the gaze, we reclaim the space it seeks to dominate." Such visual interventions do more than adorn the urban fabric. They provoke a collective pause, inviting passers-by to question the omnipresent watchfulness that has become normalized. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt once observed, the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. By embedding dissent within the public sphere, these artworks strive to keep the revolutionary spirit alive, even as the state attempts to absorb it. The 2020 data detox movement in Berlin provides a contemporary anecdote of community-driven resistance. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, citizens grew increasingly wary of the digital footprints left by contact tracing apps and remote work platforms. A coalition of technologists, privacy advocates, and local artists organized weekly detox meetups in public parks, where participants would hand over their smartphones for a symbolic cleansing ceremony. The event culminated in the creation of a communal privacy garden, a space where no Wi-Fi signals were permitted and where analog games replaced digital distractions. Participants reported a renewed sense of agency, a reminder that privacy can be cultivated as a lived practice, not merely a legal guarantee. This movement echoes Foucault's notion of making do with the resources at hand, transforming everyday spaces into sites of resistance. To understand why these tactics matter, we must situate them within a broader philosophical tradition of civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau, in his 1849 essay Civil Disobedience, declared, If the law is wrong, a man's duty is to be wrong. Thoreau's refusal to pay a poll tax's protest against slavery and the Mexican-American War set a precedent for personal noncompliance as a moral statement. Mahatma Gandhi later refined this principle into satyagraha, the force of truth, emphasizing nonviolent resistance that seeks to transform the oppressor's conscience. Both thinkers argue that the legitimacy of law is contingent upon its alignment with higher ethical standards. In the digital age, the law often takes the form of code, privacy policies, terms of service, and algorithmic governance. When these digital statutes betray fundamental rights, the act of encrypting a message or painting a subversive mural becomes a form of modern civil disobedience, a silent yet potent claim that the individual's conscience supersedes the imposed order. Yet resistance is never unchallenged. A prominent counterargument posits that encryption tools, while protecting privacy, can be appropriated by criminal enterprises, terrorist cells, and even hostile states. The argument, voiced repeatedly in parliamentary hearings across the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, asserts that going dark hampers law enforcement's ability to protect public safety. In 2016, the Australian government introduced legislation requiring backdoors in encrypted communications, arguing that the safety of our citizens must take precedence over the convenience of privacy. Critics counter that such backdoors create vulnerabilities that can be exploited by malicious actors, eroding the very security they aim to protect. As Lessig warns, when code is law, the law is only as good as the code's openness. Introducing a mandated vulnerability undermines trust in the entire digital ecosystem, potentially leading to a cascade of unintended consequences. A second critique focuses on the risk of co-optation, that the tools of resistance may be absorbed into the state's surveillance apparatus. The United Kingdom's Prevent program, for instance, has employed social media monitoring tools originally designed for community safety to track activist groups. Similarly, law enforcement agencies have begun to use Tor exit node data to identify patterns of illicit activity, effectively turning the anonymity network into a source of intelligence. This raises a philosophical dilemma. Can a technology that is inherently neutral retain its emancipatory potential when wielded by power? De Cerdo would suggest that tactics remain fluid precisely because they are practiced by the weak. The moment a tactic becomes institutionalized, it transforms into strategy, a tool of the dominant. Thus, the onus falls on activists to continually innovate, to keep the tactics one step ahead of the state's capacity to assimilate them. Real-world applications of these ideas stretch beyond the digital realm. In 2018, a collective of journalists in Mexico, facing threats from cartels and corrupt officials, adopted a digital safe house model. They encrypted their communications through Signal, stored documents in decentralized, encrypted cloud services, and used Tor to submit investigative pieces to international outlets. Their success in exposing a major oil bribery scandal illustrates how encryption can empower whistleblowers in hostile environments, reinforcing Snowden's belief that transparency is a catalyst for accountability. Conversely, the story of the 2019 Operation Safe Harbor in Sweden offers a cautionary tale. Swedish police, in collaboration with telecom providers, introduced a system that automatically flagged encrypted messaging traffic for further inspection. While the program claimed to target organized crime, civil liberties groups reported that ordinary citizens, particularly those involved in political activism, found themselves under surveillance simply for using encrypted apps. The backlash prompted a parliamentary inquiry, ultimately leading to the program's suspension. This episode underscores the delicate balance between security and freedom, a tension that has animated philosophical debates from Hobbes' social contract to contemporary discussions of the surveillance state. To deepen our understanding, let us consider an analogy drawn from the natural world. Imagine a flock of birds navigating a storm. Each bird adjusts its flight path in response to the wind, the movements of its neighbors, and the shifting clouds. No single bird controls the flock, yet together they create a dynamic, resilient formation that can weather turbulence. Encryption, artistic interventions, and community detoxes function like the bird's coordinated adjustments. They are individual acts that, when combined, reshape the atmospheric pressure of surveillance, allowing the collective to glide through the storm rather than be crushed beneath it. Historical anecdotes further illuminate the continuity of resistance. During the French resistance of World War II, underground newspapers were printed on improvised presses, smuggled through secret tunnels, and distributed in cafes under the cover of darkness. These pamphlets, like today's encrypted messages, carried information that the occupying forces sought to suppress. The resistance's use of counterintelligence tactics, false identities, coded language, and clandestine meetings mirrored the modern practice of using Tor to conceal one's digital footprint. Similarly, the Soviet-era practice of samizdat, the clandestine copying and distribution of banned literature, demonstrates how ordinary citizens can subvert state censorship by repurposing everyday tools, typewriters, carbon paper, and hand-to-hand networks, to create a parallel information sphere. Both cases illustrate that the impulse to reclaim agency in the face of surveillance is not new, it merely adopts the technologies of its time. When we reflect on the philosophical underpinnings of privacy by design, we encounter a principle that urges us to embed protective measures into the very architecture of systems, rather than tacking them on as afterthoughts. This concept resonates with the writings of Desserdo, who argued that the practice of the everyday is the place where the weak can appropriate the rules of the strong. By designing platforms where encryption is the default, where metadata is minimized, and where users retain control over their data, we shift the balance from a reactive stance, adding tools after surveillance has taken hold, to a proactive stance that anticipates and mitigates intrusion. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, embodies this ethos, mandating privacy by design and by default as a legal requirement. Yet critics note that compliance often becomes a box-checking exercise, lacking substantive change. The challenge, then, is to translate legal mandates into lived experience, ensuring that the code itself respects the dignity of its users. Lawrence Lessig's insight that code is law invites us to examine how legal frameworks interact with technological design. In the United States, the 2015 USA Freedom Act sought to limit bulk collection of phone metadata, but left open the possibility for targeted surveillance under court orders. The Act's partial reforms illustrate a tension. Lawmakers recognize the dangers of unchecked data harvesting, yet remain hesitant to dismantle the infrastructure that enables it. This ambivalence reflects a broader societal negotiation, where the desire for security coexists with an unease about surrendering privacy. As we observe the push and pull between legislative reforms and technological innovation, we see a dynamic akin to a chess game, each move prompting a counter-move, each strategy reshaping the board. The interplay between resistance and co-optation can also be seen in the evolution of the "Number Stop the Surveillance" murals. In some cities, municipal authorities have commissioned similar artworks, ostensibly to promote public awareness. While this may appear as an embrace of critique, it can also be interpreted as a subtle neutralization, transforming radical dissent into a sanctioned aesthetic that no longer threatens the underlying power structures. Michel Foucault would describe this as the transition from tactics to strategies, where the dominant appropriates the language of resistance, repackaging it as a benign public service. The crucial question, then, is whether such institutional endorsement dilutes the subversive potency of the original act, or whether it amplifies the message by reaching a broader audience. Let us return to the personal dimension of resistance, embodied in the everyday choices of citizens. When you decide to use Signal instead of a mainstream messaging app, you enact a micro-act of defiance. When you choose to walk past a CCTV camera and linger in a shadowed alley, you practice what Desserdo calls spatial tactics, the subtle manipulation of space to evade observation. These acts may seem insignificant in isolation, yet collectively they form a tapestry of dissent that reshapes the cultural landscape. As Thoreau wrote, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. By quietly refusing to be fully catalogued, we begin to dissolve that desperation, reclaiming a measure of autonomy. The legal battles that arise from these practices are as instructive as the tactics themselves. In 2018, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ruled in United States v. Apple that Apple could not be compelled to create a new version of its iPhone operating system to bypass encryption for a single investigation. The court emphasized the dangerous precedent of forcing a technology company to produce a master key. This decision reinforced the principle that the state must respect the technical safeguards that protect user privacy, lest it erode trust in the digital marketplace. Conversely, in 2022, the Indian Supreme Court upheld a law requiring messaging platforms to trace the origin of messages, effectively mandating a traceability feature that weakens end-to-end encryption. The court justified the measure as necessary for combating terrorism, highlighting the persistent tension between collective security and individual privacy. Cultural shifts accompany these legal developments. The rise of privacy as a brand in consumer electronics, Apple's privacy, that's iPhone campaigns, the inclusion of privacy badges on app stores, signals that privacy is no longer a niche concern but a mainstream expectation. Yet the commodification of privacy also raises philosophical questions. When privacy becomes a marketable feature, does it risk being reduced to a status symbol, accessible only to those who can afford premium devices? This echoes the critique offered by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thompson, who warned that the digital divide may exacerbate existing inequalities, turning privacy into a luxury rather than a universal right. In the artistic sphere, the Number Stop the Surveillance project has inspired a spate of participatory performances. In 2021, a troupe in Sao Paulo staged a flash mob where participants donned reflective jackets that turned the infrared sensors of nearby cameras into blinding light. The performance was live-streamed via Tor Hidden Service, ensuring that the audience could witness the act without revealing their location. The symbolism was clear. By turning the tools of observation back onto themselves, the performers reclaimed the gaze, turning surveillance into a mirror that reflects the state's own intrusion. This act of reappropriation aligns with the philosophical notion of subversion through inversion, a technique described by the Situationist International as determinment, the rerouting of existing cultural elements to create new, oppositional meanings. The 2020 data detox movement in Berlin also offers a vivid illustration of privacy by design and practice. Participants not only abandoned digital devices for a day, but they also co-designed a privacy toolkit that included paper wallets for cryptocurrency, analog calendars, and community-run mesh networks for local communication. By constructing an alternative infrastructure that functions without centralized data collection, they demonstrated that privacy can be engineered from the ground up, rather than retrofitted onto existing platforms. This aligns with the contemporary scholarship of scholars like Helen Nissenbaum, who argue that privacy is not merely about secrecy, but about appropriate information flows that respect contextual integrity. When we examine the broader socio-political implications, we notice a pattern. Resistance often sparks a feedback loop that forces institutions to adapt. After the 2014 Black Lives Matter live streaming events, several police departments across the United States introduced body camera policies, ostensibly to increase transparency. Yet the deployment of body cameras also introduced new layers of data collection, raising concerns about who controls the footage, how long it is stored, and whether imagine a world where every step you take, every word you utter, every flicker of your heartbeat is captured, cataloged, and interpreted by machines that never sleep. The idea is no longer the stuff of dystopian cinema. It is already unfolding in streets, airports, and even in the invisible layers of the internet that bind our daily lives. In this segment, we will follow the threads that tie together the ancient philosophical anxieties about power and knowledge with the very concrete technologies of facial recognition algorithms, biometric passports, and the sprawling Internet of Things. We will ask, what does it mean for the public sphere when the gaze of the state is amplified by artificial intelligence? How do thinkers like Nick Bostrom, Amartya Sen, and Donna Haraway help us navigate the terrain between promise and peril? And what can we learn from the lived examples of China's social credit system and autonomous surveillance drones hovering over massive concerts? Let us begin by tracing the origins of surveillance as a philosophical concern. The roots of the surveillance problem stretch back to the early modern period, when Michel Foucault later coined the term panopticism to describe the architecture of power in Jeremy Bentham's circular prison. Bentham imagined a central watchtower from which a single guard could see every cell, while the prisoners, never knowing whether they were being observed, would internalize the discipline. Foucault wrote, "The Panopticon is a symbol of the disciplinary society, a mechanism of power that functions by making visible what would otherwise be invisible." This insight already hinted at a paradox. Visibility can be both a tool of control and a precondition for freedom. In the digital age, the Panopticon has been transformed from stone walls into streams of data, from a single guard to a network of sensors, and from a metaphorical tower to a global architecture of algorithmic oversight. When we move into the 20th century, the philosophical conversation widens. Martin Heidegger warned that technology is not merely a set of instruments but a mode of revealing, a way in which the world shows itself to us. He famously said, "The essence of technology is not something technological." For Heidegger, the danger lies not in the devices themselves, but in the mindset that reduces everything, including human beings, to standing reserve, resources to be measured, optimized, and deployed. In the context of AI-driven surveillance, the standing reserve becomes a data point, a facial map, a biometric signature. The technology does not merely watch, it reshapes what it means to be a subject, to be seen, to be accountable. Fast forward to the present, and we encounter a new generation of thinkers who take these classic concerns and apply them to the unprecedented scale of contemporary data collection. Nick Bostrom, in his seminal work on existential risk, cautions that a super-intelligent monitoring system could become an intelligence explosion that outpaces human oversight. He writes, if a machine could predict and influence human behavior with near certainty, it would acquire a form of power that is difficult to imagine, let alone control. Bostrom's fear is not simply that surveillance will be invasive, but that it could evolve into a form of agency that eclipses democratic governance, turning the public sphere into a self-regulating algorithmic organism. Amartya Sen, on the other hand, offers a more human-centered lens through the capabilities approach. He argues that true development is about expanding the freedoms and capabilities of individuals to lead the lives they value. In a digital context, Sen would ask, do surveillance technologies expand or contract the real freedoms of citizens? He would be wary of a system that, under the guise of security, narrows the space for political participation, expression, and privacy, capabilities essential for a flourishing public sphere. Sen's perspective reminds us that any evaluation of surveillance must be measured against the concrete opportunities it creates or destroys for ordinary people. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto adds another layer, insisting that the boundary between human and machine is already blurred and that we must embrace the hybrid nature of our identities. She writes, the cyborg is a kind of mythic figure that refuses to be bound by the essentialist notions of gender, class, or species. In the age of biometric passports and wearable sensors, we become literal cyborgs, our bodies extended into data streams. Haraway would urge us to see surveillance not only as a tool of domination, but also as a site of potential agency, where new forms of political subjectivity can emerge if we learn to navigate the entanglements wisely. These philosophical strands converge when we examine the concrete examples that illustrate how surveillance is being woven into the fabric of everyday life. Consider China's social credit system, a sprawling initiative that aggregates financial records, traffic violations, online behavior, and even social interactions into a single score that determines access to services, travel privileges, and even the ability to rent an apartment. The system is not a single monolithic algorithm, but a patchwork of municipal pilots, private data brokers, and state-run platforms. Its proponents argue that it incentivizes trustworthy behavior, reduces fraud, and creates a more harmonious society. Yet critics point to the erosion of privacy, the potential for arbitrary punishment, and the chilling effect on dissent. The social credit system embodies the optimistic argument that AI can create transparent governance, but it also exemplifies the counterargument that surveillance, when embedded in a technocratic vision, can become a tool for social control that bypasses traditional democratic checks. A second, more kinetic example lies in the deployment of autonomous drones for crowd monitoring at large events, music festivals, political rallies, sporting championships. These drones, equipped with high-resolution cameras and real-time facial recognition software, can scan thousands of faces within seconds, flagging individuals on watch lists, detecting anomalies, and even predicting potential disturbances through pattern recognition algorithms. The promise, as articulated by event organizers, is a safer environment, quicker response to emergencies, and reduced need for human security personnel. Yet the very presence of hovering machines that can read our expressions and movements raises profound questions about consent and the right to assemble without being constantly profiled. The drones illustrate how surveillance technologies are moving from static installations into mobile, adaptive agents that can follow us across spaces, blurring the line between public safety and pervasive monitoring. To understand the stakes, let us pause and recall two recent anecdotes that have shaped public discourse. In 2021, Clearview AI unveiled a massive facial recognition database that scraped billions of images from social media platforms without user consent. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began purchasing access to this database, enabling them to match suspect photos to individuals with unprecedented speed. The revelation sparked a wave of lawsuits, protests, and a patchwork of state bans. As one of the plaintiffs argued, when a private company can turn my face into a searchable datum, my autonomy is reduced to a line of code. The Clearview episode highlighted how private profit motives can accelerate the spread of surveillance technologies, often outpacing the development of legal safeguards. 2 years later, in 2023, the European Union's debate over the Digital Services Act, DSA, brought the question of platform accountability to the fore. Lawmakers argued that large online services should be required to disclose algorithmic decision-making processes, provide users with redress mechanisms, and mitigate systemic harms such as disinformation. Critics, however, warned that the DSA could inadvertently legitimize more intrusive monitoring under the banner of transparency, granting platforms the authority to surveil content and user behavior in the name of compliance. The debate underscored a tension that runs through all contemporary surveillance discussions: the promise of regulation as a safety valve versus the risk that regulation itself becomes a conduit for deeper data extraction. These stories lead us to the first major counterargument: the optimistic view that AI can usher in transparent governance, reducing corruption by making every transaction visible. Proponents point to blockchain-based voting systems, open data portals, and predictive analytics that can flag irregularities in public procurement. They argue that when every official action is recorded and searchable, the space for backroom deals shrinks dramatically. Indeed, in some municipalities, AI-driven audit tools have uncovered patterns of waste that human auditors missed, leading to significant savings. However, this optimism rests on the assumption that the data itself is neutral and that the algorithms interpreting it are free from bias. As Bostrom reminds us, an intelligence that can predict behavior may also manipulate it, turning transparency into a veneer for control. Moreover, the very act of making all data visible can create new vulnerabilities: data breaches, misuse by malicious actors, and the reduction of complex human decisions to quantifiable metrics. The second counterargument asserts that surveillance is inevitable, an inescapable byproduct of modern life, and that the proper response is not to resist but to regulate ethically. This view holds that, given the benefits of early disease detection through health monitoring wearables, or the efficiency gains from smart city traffic sensors, we should accept a baseline level of monitoring and focus on establishing robust privacy safeguards, oversight bodies, and transparent governance structures. The argument draws on a pragmatic tradition dating back to John Stuart Mill's harm principle, suggesting that as long as surveillance does not cause direct harm, it can be justified. Yet the historical record cautions us that harmless data can be repurposed for repression. The Stasi in East Germany, for instance, built an extensive surveillance network under the pretense of protecting socialist values, only to use it to silence dissent and enforce conformity. The lesson is that the line between benign oversight and oppressive control is porous, and that regulatory frameworks often lag behind technological innovation. To navigate these tensions, we can turn to normative frameworks that blend the insights of Sen's capabilities approach with Haraway's cyborg politics. One proposal is to treat digital inclusion as a capability in its own right: the ability to control one's digital persona, to opt in or out of data collection, and to understand the implications of algorithmic decisions. This reframes privacy not merely as a negative right, freedom from intrusion, but as a positive capacity to shape one's digital self. In practice, this could mean mandating explainable AI standards for any system that assigns scores affecting access to services, as in the social credit context, and ensuring that individuals receive clear, actionable feedback when their data is used. It also suggests that designers of autonomous drones should embed human-in-the-loop mechanisms, allowing operators to intervene or override automated alerts, thereby preserving a degree of human judgment and accountability. Speculative fiction offers another lens through which to examine these possibilities. In the novel The Circle by Dave Eggers, a tech conglomerate creates a single sign-on system that tracks every user's activity, promising safety and convenience while eroding anonymity. The narrative warns that the desire for total transparency can become a social pressure, where opting out is seen as suspicious. Similarly, the television series Black Mirror frequently dramatizes scenarios where facial recognition and biometric data are weaponized against citizens, illustrating how quickly the line between protective surveillance and invasive control can blur. These stories do not merely entertain, they function as modern myths that surface collective anxieties and help us articulate the ethical stakes before they become entrenched policies. Policy scenarios can be imagined along a spectrum. At one extreme, a surveillance utopia would entail a fully integrated AI governance network, where every public service is optimized in real time, corruption is eliminated, and citizens receive personalized feedback on how to improve their civic contributions. At the opposite end, a surveillance dystopia envisions a world where biometric passports double as passports to a Panopticon, drones track dissenting crowds, and social credit scores dictate life chances, all without meaningful oversight. Between these poles lies a middle ground, a surveillance commons where data is treated as a shared resource, governed by democratic institutions and subject to regular audits and public deliberation. In this model, the state, private firms, and civil society co-manage the data ecosystem, each with clearly defined responsibilities and checks. Returning to the philosophical tradition of technocracy, we recall that Heidegger's critique of technology as a mode of enframing, Gestel, warns that we risk seeing the world solely as a standing reserve. Technocracy, the idea that experts should rule based on technical rationality, can amplify this tendency, sidelining democratic deliberation in favor of algorithmic efficiency. Yet, as Haraway suggests, the cyborg can also be a figure of resistance, a hybrid that subverts binary oppositions. If we imagine citizens as digital cyborgs who can negotiate the terms of their data integration, we open space for a politics of co-creation rather than domination. Cross-referencing earlier discussions on ethics and power, we see that the surveillance debate is not an isolated issue, but part of a larger tapestry of how technology reshapes authority. The classic liberal argument for limited government, championed by John Locke, rests on the premise that individuals retain a sphere of private life untouched by the state. Surveillance technologies erode that sphere, demanding a reevaluation of what private means in a networked age. Likewise, Michel Foucault's notion of biopower, the governance of populations through the regulation of bodies, finds new expression in biometric passports that encode health data, travel histories, and even genetic markers. The power to classify and manage bodies now operates at a scale unimaginable to Foucault, yet his insights remain eerily prescient. Let us examine the mechanics of facial recognition technology, the linchpin of many contemporary surveillance systems. At its core, the algorithm extracts a set of mathematical features, distances between key facial landmarks, texture patterns, and three-dimensional contours, to create a vector representation of a face. This vector is then compared against a database using similarity metrics. While the mathematics may appear neutral, the training data is often skewed. Studies have shown higher error rates for darker skin tones and for women, leading to false positives that can have severe consequences, from wrongful arrests to denial of services. The Clearview AI controversy highlighted this bias, as the scraped images predominantly came from platforms where certain demographics are overrepresented. The ethical implication is clear. If a system that determines access to public spaces or financial services is built on biased data, it perpetuates structural inequalities, directly contravening SEN's capabilities framework. Biometric passports illustrate another dimension of surveillance, state-controlled identity. These passports embed an electronic chip that stores facial images, fingerprints, and iris scans, enabling rapid verification at border controls. Proponents argue that this enhances security and streamlines travel. Critics, however, point out that the same chip can be read remotely, creating opportunities for covert tracking. In a world where the Internet of Things interconnects appliances, vehicles, and even streetlights, the biometric data stored in a passport could be cross-referenced with data from a smart home thermostat, building a profile that extends far beyond the moment of border crossing. The convergence of these technologies suggests a future where identity is no longer a static document, but a dynamic, continuously updated data stream. The Internet of Things itself is an expanding lattice of sensors that collect granular data about our environment and behavior. Smart meters record electricity usage down to the minute, wearables monitor heart rate and sleep patterns, and connected cars transmit location data in real time. Each node contributes to an ever-growing surveillance matrix, feeding AI models that can predict not only where you will be tomorrow, but also what you might purchase, who you might meet, and how you might vote. The predictive capacity of such systems raises a question that Bostrom would find unsettling. If an algorithm can forecast human actions with high accuracy, does it acquire a form of soft power that can influence those very actions? The feedback loop where predictions shape behavior, which in turn refines predictions, creates a self-reinforcing cycle that can be harnessed for social engineering. In light of these developments, what normative principles can guide policy? One proposal is the principle of proportionality drawn from human rights law, which requires that any intrusion into privacy be necessary, suitable, and the least restrictive means to achieve a legitimate aim. Applied to AI surveillance, this would mean that facial recognition should only be deployed in contexts where there is a clear, demonstrable need, such as locating missing persons, rather than blanket usage in public spaces. Another principle is data minimization, a cornerstone of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which mandates that only the data strictly required for a purpose be collected and retained for a limited period. In practice, this could require that drone footage be automatically blurred after a set time unless a specific incident warrants retention. Yet even robust legal frameworks can be circumvented. The function creep phenomenon describes how data collected for one purpose gradually expands to new, often unrelated uses. A biometric passport's data could be shared with immigration enforcement, health agencies, and commercial advertisers, each justified by a different policy rationale. This underscores the importance of purpose limitation clauses that are enforceable and transparent, ensuring that citizens can trace how their data moves across institutional boundaries. Speculative policy scenarios also invite us to imagine alternative futures. Consider a data dividend model, where citizens receive a share of the economic value generated by their personal data. This approach aligns with Sen's emphasis on capabilities by turning data extraction into a source of empowerment rather than exploitation. In such a system, individuals could choose to sell or withhold specific biometric markers, thereby exercising agency over their digital selves. Alternatively, a surveillance commons could be established, where community-governed data repositories allow local oversight of AI tools, akin to a cooperative. This would embody Haraway's vision of the cyborg as a site of collective agency, where the boundaries between human and machine are negotiated democratically. The role of speculative fiction in shaping public imagination cannot be overstated. In the novel Neuromancer, William Gibson introduced the concept of the Matrix as a virtual space where data flows invisibly, hinting at a future where surveillance is not just physical but also digital. More recently, the video game Watch Dogs: Legion depicts a London where citizens can be recruited as operatives by a decentralized network, each equipped with facial recognition implants that both empower and endanger them. These narratives serve as cautionary tales, reminding us that technological possibilities are always embedded within social choices. Returning to the real-world examples, let